Good morning. This week we're looking at two more Psalms of David. Again, remember David wrote 73 of the 150 in our English Bible, and so the odds are pretty good you're going to come across a Psalm of David quite frequently. This morning we're looking at Psalm number 30. Psalm 30 is an interesting one, but let's go ahead and read it first, and then we'll come back and talk about some of the interesting trivia that might be associated with it, as well as work through the text in front of us. So let's start at verse 1. I will extol you, O Lord, for you have drawn me up, and have not let my foes rejoice over me. O Lord my God, I cried to you for help, and you have healed me. O Lord, you have brought up my soul from Sheol. You restored me to life from among those who go down to the pit. Sing praises to the Lord, O you, his saints, and give thanks to his holy name. For his anger is but for a moment, and his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes with the morning. As for me, I said in my prosperity, I shall never be moved. By your favor, O Lord, you made my mountain strong, or stand strong. You hid your face. I was dismayed. To you, O Lord, I cry, and to the Lord I plead for mercy. What profit is there in my death if I go down to the pit? Will the dust praise you? Will it tell your faithfulness? Hear, O Lord, and be merciful to me. O Lord, be my helper. You have turned for me my mourning into dancing. You have loosed my sackcloth. You've clothed me with gladness. But that my glory may sing your praise and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever. So again, we're looking at a Psalm of David this morning. One of the things that we rarely talk about, but something that's actually quite important, at least in terms of Bible study, are the titles of the Psalms. Look at your Bible and look there at Psalm number 30. I'm not talking about what in the ESV, the English Standard Version, joy comes with a morning. That's drawn from one of the verses later in the song. That's not the title per se, or what's sometimes referred to as the superscript. The title or superscript is what is in the case of the ESV, included in italics before verse 1. Now, as often is the case in many of the Psalms. So look at any number one and see if you might recognize a title or superscript there. But if this particular one says a Psalm of David, this is how we know the author according to what has been handed down to us in the manuscript evidence, and a song at the dedication of the temple. Now, many of them just simply say a Psalm of David. A few of them occasionally add for us circumstantial evidence to tell us this was the case of when Absalom rose up in a coup against his father, or whatever the case might be. This one's interesting in that it's a song at the dedication of the temple. If you remember your Old Testament history, David desired to build a temple, but God would let him do it. And so if this is a song at the dedication of the temple, it might be a song that David had written and that later Solomon had sung at the temple. Or one scholar, at least I'm aware of, maybe more, suggested that David perhaps wrote this song in preparation for the dedication of the temple, in the same way that he had provided all the materials for Solomon to build with, since God wouldn't let him build it himself. Interesting information there. Now add to that the fact that as we read Psalm 30, there's nothing in the psalm itself about the temple. Instead, it's a personal testimony. I almost said a personal plea, but it begins with testimony and then ends with plea. But again, it's another psalm that apparently has something to do with David's personal life and experience. Like so many of the songs that we sing on any given Sunday morning, it's a song about what happened to David, but has enough commonality that we can pick it up and recognize our life circumstances in the song as well. And so let's look at the song in light of that this morning. What does it have to say about David, and what does it have to say to us? The first part of the psalm begins with David praising God. He begins, I will extol you. I will lift your name up. I'll make much of you, O Lord. Remember, O Lord is covenant language. And so he's speaking of the relationship with God via the covenant, God's grace, God's mercy reaching out, rescuing him. I will extol you, O Lord. Why? Verse 1, for you have drawn me up and have not let my foes rejoice over me. Now, the picture might seem like he's sounding like he's talking about victory over a battle, but as we continue on into this first part of the psalm, you'll notice that there's no other mention of battle or warfare. In fact, the lifting David up seems to be physical, related to illness rather than to combat. The rejoicing of the foes that God did not allow happen is perhaps a reference to many of them would have rejoiced at the day of David's death had he died prematurely because of health issues. Verse 2 continues, O Lord, again, covenant language, my God, Elohim, the creator God. So a recognition that his covenant God, the one to whom he relates, is the God who made the universe. I cried to you for help. Past tense. He cried out to God in this situation. And what did God do for him according to verse 2? You healed me. So it is a physical healing. O Lord, you have brought up my soul from Sheol. You've restored my life among those who go down to the pit. The language here of Sheol is not a reference to hell, as often interpreted or argued in sermons or Bible studies. But Sheol is the pit. It's the place of death. It's there in the Old Testament where those who have passed, those who have been deceased, go following their death. And so David, whatever his illness was on the verge of death, and God brought him back from the edge. Saved him, if you will, physically from death. You brought my soul back from Sheol. You restored my life from among those who go down. So what's his response to God's rescuing him physically? Sing praises to the Lord, O you his saints, and give thanks to his holy name. Recognize that God's mercy, God's grace is what gives us life, it gives us hope. The recognition here that God's anger is but for a moment and his favor is for a lifetime. This is probably a reference to David acknowledging that death is the result of sin in the world, and in the case of his own particular circumstance, while vague about what it was, perhaps he's recognizing that he deserved what God had given him, that like King Hezekiah, he had been struck ill and then restored because of God's mercy, struck ill because of some sin or some rebellion, restored because of God's grace. And then comes what the ESV gives as the title, a verse that perhaps you've heard related to a song singing of the resurrection of Jesus on Sunday morning after the crucifixion. Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes with the morning. Think of the joy that the Marys and the others felt when they realized the tomb was empty on that Sunday morning. But think of any number of times in your life where the longest night of your life and the morning comes, the new day gives you new hope. That's the kind of imagery David is talking about here, conceiving for us with his pen. As for me, he says in verse 6, I said in my prosperity, I shall never be moved. So when life was good, David was confident that everything was perfect. He recognizes verse 7, by your favor, O Lord, you have made my mountain stand strong. And so here he is claiming in verse 6 that he is confident that he's going to survive. Then he realizes in verse 7, perhaps again in hindsight, that God is the one who made his mountain stand strong. The mountain is a symbol of strength, stability, that can't be moved. But maybe perhaps in response to David's arrogance in verse 6, verse 7 says, you hid your face. God turned his back, so to speak, on David, and David was dismayed. And so we've gone from the elation of physical healing to now, again, symbolically, a pit of God's abandonment for the moment anyway. To you, O Lord, I cry. So David is now present tense, crying out for God's mercy. Based on what God has done for him in the past, David knows that God can do it again. To you, O Lord, I cry, and to the Lord I plead for mercy. And then notice almost he begins to negotiate, if you will, to barter, to bargain. Not that God responds to those, but it's human reaction, human response, right? Human nature. If you'll do this, this is how I'll respond. What profit is there in my death if I go down to the pit? Will the dust praise you? Will it tell of your faithfulness? So if I die, Lord, I can't tell people about how good and merciful you are anymore. Hear, O Lord, and be merciful to me. O Lord, be my helper. Rescue me. Now David's response. You have turned for me my mourning into dancing. You've loosed my sackcloth. You've clothed me with gladness. Think of Job sitting in dust and ashes in sackcloth. God has restored David again. Why? That my glory may sing your praise and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever. So David is not anticipating life after death at the moment, going, I'll praise you forever and ever there. What David is anticipating is if God will restore him one more time, it gives David one more thing to sing God's praises for, one more thing to tell the world about. And so just as God has rescued him from physical ailment earlier in the psalm, and he gave God the praise for it, now David, in whatever turmoil he's in, is praying once more that God will rescue him again so that David can tell others about God's mercy and grace one more time. This morning, look at your life. Take stock of God's mercy in your past. Give him praise. Thank him for it. And if right now, if you're in the pit, right now, if you're in trouble, right now, if life is not going quite the way you imagined, you know from past experience, whether yours or David's, that God answers prayer. Cry out to him again. Don't negotiate with him. You have nothing to offer that he does not have. You remember, he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. But cry out to him. And then when he rescues you, make sure that you give him all the praise and glory for it again. Sing his praises and share your testimony of God's faithfulness.